Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda Wick, and I am the curator of the Charles Babbage Institute Archives. On behalf of the First Fridays Committee and the Ask Department, welcome to First Fridays. The season's theme is To Whom It May Concern. We will explore the correspondence, letters, notes, messages, and other forms of mail that comprise the backbone of the archives. Today's presentation will also be posted later on the University of Minnesota Library's YouTube channel. First Fridays is a monthly series of presentations made possible by a generous gift from Governor Elmer L. Anderson and Mrs. Eleanor Anderson in honor of former library director, Dr. Edward B. Stanford. The presentations are based on materials in the University Library's archives and special collections. A special thank you to the interpreters from Middle English who will be providing American Sign Language interpretation for today's presentation. If time allows, we will have a question and answer session at the end. If the Zoom audience members have any questions for our speakers today, please submit them using the Q&A function and not the chat so that we can keep track of your questions. In-person audience, please hold your questions until the end. After the presentations and the Q&A, there will also be a tour of the Archives and Special Collections Department's caverns with our director, Chris Kiesling, and she's right over here in green. First of all, I'd like to pause for a brief land acknowledgement. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. Our presentations today feature the Social Welfare History Archives and the James Ford Bell Library. Our first presentation is Delivering History, Messages from the Social Welfare History Archives by Linnea Anderson, archivist of the Social Welfare History Archives. From search letters to hate mail to telegrams, mail in the archives helps tell the story of the social work history. We will explore examples of personal and professional communications from the Social Welfare History Archives, and puzzle lovers will have a chance to translate coded messages from Vice investigators. Our second presentation is Trading Letters, Seeing the World Through Merchant Correspondence by Dr. Marguerite Regnault, curator of the James Ford Bell Library. In the days before modern technology, it could take people and letters 6 months or more to reach their destination. Imagine conducting business at that pace. It was a waiting game, too, for merchant families, as news of their loved ones was scant, scarce, and often disastrous. Join the Bell Library for a glimpse into the merchant life, both at home and abroad. So with that, I'm going to introduce Linnea Anderson. Thanks, Amanda.
Okay. Nearly every collection at the Social Welfare History Archives has at least some correspondence in it. And a search of the collection guides results in a list of over 12,000 folders that have the word correspondence, memos, or letters in the folder label. And today I am going to explore 2 topics where the act of sending and receiving information by mail is a key element of the story, and where the historical evidence consists at least partly of letters and mass mailings. So the first is going to be opposition to public school sex education and family life education in the mid-20th century. And then we'll dive into social hygiene and vice investigations. And for all of you who are puzzle lovers, we will end with the coded telegram. So letters and mass mailings in the National Council on Family Relations records and the American Social Health Association records document the themes, tactics, and primary targets of opponents of sex education and family life education in the 1960s and early 1970s. While researching this talk, I found folders labeled Opposition to Family Life and Sex Education. That sounded pretty intriguing. There's nothing like some controversy to spice up the archival records. So I dug in. The files contain correspondence between staff at the National Council and ASHA and their colleagues at other organizations promoting and researching sex education or public health, as well as letters to and from local school districts and state education officials. And this slide is a list showing sort of an inventory of items that they received. So the letters and related enclosures document anti-sex ed campaigns by groups such as the John Birch Society, a right-wing anti-communist conspiracy theory group, the Christian Crusade, the Liberty Lobby, and numerous local grassroots groups, often composed of parents. The main targets of these groups were school districts, the state legislatures, and the Sex Information and Education Council of the United States, formed by former Planned Parenthood medical director Dr. Mary Calderon in 1964 to promote sex education as part of healthy development for children and youth. SECUS, as I'm going to call it, ASHA and the National Council staff took the position that they should stick to the facts and not engage with what one family life education coordinator called the lunatic fringe. And just in case it's not clear, it's a little hard to see. So the protest, that's a parent group with signs that say family life and sex ed is a no-no. And then the pink pamphlet with the very dramatic but unexplicable faces on the front is actually an anti-SECUS. So SECUS Corrupter of Youth is the title of that, that pamphlet. So in this slide, we see some handwritten notes from the National Council on Family Relations, what to do, written at the top. And their ideas include don't debate, work from strengths, and put as little in writing as possible. Not bad advice. And then there's a Planned Parenthood memo that states that some local opposition groups are exceeding the limits of genuine community debate by conducting all-out personal attacks. However, the success of the opposition clearly put the pressure on these organizations, as evidenced by a number of other letters. So this letter from SECUS is one example. It notes the crude messaging, conspiracy theories, and legislative successes of extremist groups and declares it is time for reasonable people to take a stand. And in this slide, we see a photo of Elizabeth Force, who was the director of family life education at the American Social Health Association. It looks like she would not take guff from anyone, by the way. And Force was one of the people who tried to bring reason and facts to the table, but her position was not an easy one. She ended up at a lot of public meetings. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of information on what happened there. And then the clippings on the state investigations of school sex ed in California were sent to her by her boss, Donald Clough, director of ASHA, warning that when they get through with SECUS, they may call us. And then the post-it down in the front says, if the earthquakes don't sink us, as a reference to California, the Birch Society certainly will. And then this letter from SECUS warns of a right-wing drive to take over school boards and the complacency or apathy on the part of moderates. This memo, pardon me. So this memo on an interagency conference on current opposition to family life and sex education in 1969, right, strategizes how to counter the opposition and notes the interrelationship of political issues and school-based sex ed and the implications for a democratic society in a way that might seem a little familiar now. An activist group's toolkit included letter writing campaigns to districts and legislatures, as well as mass mailings. And these created controversy and misinformation and pressured state education commissioners, local school boards, and elected officials. Facing noisy opposition and apparently little input from supporters of sex ed, Legislatures launched investigations and passed or proposed laws that revised or ended sex ed programs, and some school districts canceled their programs as a result of public furor or over fear that the teachers would lose their credentials. So, for example, this letter to the Santa Cruz Public Schools is a warning to staff about the state moratorium on sex education due to new state laws. You can see I pulled out an excerpt there for you. The materials preserved in the archives reveal how the opposition used now familiar themes in these mailings. So family life education, to start, was portrayed as a moral and spiritual threat. And this is deeply ironic because the records in the Social Welfare History Archives also show how early to mid-20th century sex ed programs promoted sexual health information, but did so in a framework of personal morality, marriage, binary relationships, and traditional gender and sex roles, and the nuclear family as the cornerstone of society. And opponents also argued that sex knowledge would lead to sexual activity and threaten the innocence of children and lead to the corruption of youth. They employed scare tactics about sex ed and pornography, sexual perversion or homosexuality, and even communism, always a favorite talking point in the mid-century. Yes, did you know that sex ed was a communist plot turning America's youth into sex-mad pinkos? Opponents also targeted what they viewed as a waste of taxpayer dollars put towards sex ed instead of the 3 Rs. And these mailings often also mocked programs such as sensitivity training. So the item shown here is the Schoolhouse, the Proper Place to Teach Raw Sex, was mailed to parents in California and packs in most of these arguments. It even accuses the National Education Association of being the voice of Marxist liberalism and warns about sex rooms in Swedish schools. So another tactic was to portray sex ed as a threat to parental authority, and opponents were successful in getting some states to pass requirements for parental notification or permission for children to attend sex ed class. So this slide shows a proposed law in New York for parental consent, and also a school district newsletter that reassures parents by noting the quality of its sex ed curriculum and widespread parental approval for it, and also by showing a Family Life Education Committee reviewing the curriculum materials. So there's some more examples on this slide. The flyer from POSE, Parents Opposed to Sex Education in Public Schools, cites right to privacy, freedom of religion, and parental rights. And the right-hand flyer from California instructs parents to attend school board meeting or to call the school board members. And in this slide, the flyer on the left equates sex ed and sensitivity training to brainwashing and also hits many other anti-sex ed talking points. And the one on the right engages in fear-mongering about elementary children and information on sex. And it also drums up panic about GLBTQ people and about what are labeled deviant sex practices. So, internal communications and letters show how leaders at SIECUS, the NCFR, and ASHA tried to counter these attacks, and also their belief that reason, persistence, and communication would win out. But the language and tactics documented here also resonate with current issues and messages that have definitely not died out over time. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to switch from sex education to vice, which is not a very big leap if you believe the anti-sex ed crusaders. The ASHA community survey files, vice investigation and field report records, and the wonderfully titled dubious files document social hygiene and vice investigations that took place both in communities and by mail. And these files are a gold mine of information on the underground world of illicit medical treatments and mail order medicines, among many other topics. ASHA often targeted pharmacies, herbal shops, quack healers, mystics, and pretend doctors with names like Dr. J.R. Maybe and Dr. B. Lust. And these examples include a lovely illustration of Dr. Maybe, men's doctor, and advertising cards from Mother Helen's SMS Herb and Health Institute entitling the bearer to a free consultation. And here are some more examples of mail order medicinal remedy advertisements. And one tactic in this campaign was to send a letter to the target of the investigation using an assumed name and describing a litany of fake symptoms or responding to newspaper or magazine ad. And some of those letters survive in the files, such as the one on this slide addressed to Yogi Roy, describing some symptoms that are a little hard to read, and I probably actually won't read them out in public anyway. So this ASHA report, there's an excerpt here on Yogi Roy, also known as Yogi H-6, discusses use of the assumed name letter strategy and includes a wonderful photo of the Yogi's store. It appears that at least a good portion of these types of letters were written by an ASHA staff person or persons who used the fake surname Pease that appears on the letter on the left. And sometimes the writer presented themselves as single or married, as a man or as a woman, whatever would attract the target of the investigation. And they often used the same return address on Holland Avenue in the Bronx, New York, care of someone named Auerbach. Now, that was not a made-up name. Samuel Auerbach turns out to be the Associate Director of the American Social Health Association's Division of Medical Measures and Division of Public Information and Extension. And letters in the files describe his crusade against quackery. So I love the annotation on this postcard advertising the company Medical Films, which is selling a pretty sensational menu of 8x10 glossies, including the inevitable nudist colony photos. And the annotation says, "Let's go after him, a job for Auerbach." And here are examples of letters using the name Pease, both Miss and Mr. The one on the left advises what is actually a pretty healthy nutritional plan to drink plenty of milk and eat a lot of fruits and vegetables. And here are some examples of letters addressed to or from Pease, all using the same address in the Bronx and all care of Auerbach. The red annotations are mine. So even better, the files also include replies from the targets of these investigations, and these usually have some version of dire warnings about disease progress and symptoms, assertions that they have the key to the cure, a tonic, pill, elixir, mystery powder, or some other product, and of course, the cost of the treatment. For example, the 1930 letter shown here offers to sell a month of treatments for $30, which is the equivalent of over $500 now. In a few cases, you can see letters going back and forth in which ASHA and the target are leading each other on with follow-up questions about their supposed symptoms or where to send payments or promises of a cure and increasingly urgent warnings or demands for money, as shown in this slide. And I want to point out the highlighted section, those are my highlights, of this letter from Yogi Roy. If some other doctor in New York will come to know, they will take your job, and they have to report to the health department. And so here are some more examples of these types of messages. I love the letterhead of the Yaqui Herbal Medicine Company, so that's why I included that today. That's really, that kind of letterhead I think is a lost art. As entertaining as these letters are to us now, preventing the use of fake cures was a serious component of ASHA's campaign to fight STIs. ASHA worked to prevent misinformation and fake treatments and promoted reliable health information to educate the public and medical practitioners. Pretend cures were a factor in disease transmission if the unknowing dupes of the quack healers thought they were cured or misunderstood their condition and continued to spread an STI. So ASHA's dubious files kept track of unofficial hygiene associations, doctors or fake doctors, lecturers, businesses, and publishers whom they thought were peddling false information or misusing the hygiene credential. They were very sensitive about that. So letters in the dubious files to and from Paul Kinsey, the Director of Legal and Social Protection, Associate Director Gene Pinney, and others at ASHA show a network of correspondence with supporters, local hygiene or public decency associations, local or state officials or post office authorities, the American Medical Association, and other professional groups. And they were often intended to check the credentials for an organization or individual who got on their hygiene radar, or track the progress of investigations, or to share information. And the dubious files let us dip into this shady world of carnival barkers, medicine shows, public sex lecturers, con artists, and fly-by-night companies, hoping to cash in on the public interest and lurid appeal of sex hygiene and the sensationalism of the dramatic symptoms and situations surrounding STIs. And we get a glimpse of a cast of characters that someone really should write a book or a movie script about. I only have time for a few examples today. So the first is Jardin. I've decided we're going to pronounce her name Jardin Macri. She presented film and lecture series in the US and Canada, where she also sold her pamphlets, such as Sex Problems and Advice, which one writer described as full of truths, half-truths, and dangerous lies. And another letter calls the sections in her pamphlets on marriage, nudism, and birth control undesirable and an unwholesome piece of literature. And this sort of mashup of everything sex and VD related with a dose of nudity appears to be the usual formula for publications of this type. And then Asha received this letter complaining about, this letter complaining about a health and sex hygiene lecturer at the Beckman Garrity Carnival in San Antonio, Texas. And it exclaimed, "The barkers in front of this sideshow are dressed like doctors and the girls are dressed like nurses." No photos, sorry. The sideshow consists of lurid pictures and inflammatory lectures catering to the lowest elements. And this letter to Jean Pinney, shown on the right, from the American Medical Association, described the Medical Liberty League as an opera bouffe organization consisting of diet fakers, chiropractors, low-grade osteopaths, anti-vivisectionists, and gentlemen who sell sunlight at high prices. And also, no, it's hard to see, but there's a reference in this letter to the anti-vaccination and anti-pasteurization campaigns pursued by the former head of the organization. So a key theme that emerges in the correspondence is the application of laws prohibiting the sending of obscene material by mail to investigate publishers. So for example, this letter between a post office inspector and Paul Kinsey discusses the Eugenics Publishing Company, known for quasi-medical and erotica texts, which Kinsey has referred to the inspector and to the Society to Maintain Public Decency. The inspector promises to forward the information to government authorities. He also notes that the same book being discussed was named in the indictment of another publisher for mailing pornography, which resulted in a guilty plea and a suspended jail sentence. And this slide, this one actually shows some additional letters complaining about Jardin Macri and also the Eugenics Publishing Company, which was the subject of the previous letter. And letters received or sent by Asha in 1949 document reaction to a book, Beautiful Sinners of New York. And yes, I Googled it, and no, there is not much information on it. So the letter from the Society for Public Decency references Ideal Books in Lower Manhattan. And that society sent someone they refer to as an agent to Ideal Books to obtain a copy, which was mailed to him, thereby breaking the laws against mailing obscene materials. The writer who received and read the book opined that it was actionable as obscene and followed up with the U.S. Post Office inspector. So you can kind of see how this network works. These are just a couple of examples of many such references in the files. So I'm going to wrap up with correspondence dating from the 1950s that was sent to ASHA headquarters from field representatives and investigators around the country, some of whom worked undercover. They wrote about healthcare and law enforcement, prostitution, STI rates, crime, and related issues in communities around the U.S. They recounted meetings with local hygiene associations, city leaders, public health officials, military base commanders, law enforcement district attorneys, and others. And most of the letters from field reps give progress updates. They discuss plans or areas to target or people to meet with, or they report back on their findings. And they mention visits to hotels, bars, and nightclubs and give updates on their meetings or evaluate local officials, such as their assessment of whether the DA is on board with prosecutions or whether the local sheriff or police are ignoring or even promoting vice and crime. There's some good local gossip in these letters and reports as well, let me tell you. So occasionally things got a little out of hand. And this letter relates to an investigation in Leadville, Colorado, was written to the ASHA field rep for Colorado from the director of the State Department of Health VD Control Division. And it reads like a noir action film. The State Department of Health sent 2 undercover investigators to Leadville. And here is what ensued. It's worth quoting at length. Dr. Martinez, who's one of the investigators, or Mr. Martinez, was threatened 3 times, and one man made an attempt to draw a gun on him. Mr. Pester, I haven't figured out who he is yet, was chased by a carload of goons with a police car joining in the chase. Our men unearthed the fact that most of the trouble in Leadville is headed by a vice lord known as Tony Musso and a lady known as Bonnie. I have contacted the FBI, and they are working on the problem from their angle. Martinez, Zook, who is the other undercover investigator, and myself went to the camp commander's office at Carson yesterday. And we presented not only the prostitution situation, but the fact that soldiers had been beaten up in the gambling houses, were getting shortchanged in the saloons, and were being encouraged to drink by B-girls until they were drunk. And of course, at that stage, anything can happen. So there are many substantive field representative letters, but the majority are routine or deal with administrative matters, basically minor hassles, bureaucracy, accounting, or workplace disagreements. However, these can now be a wonderful example of how correspondence in the archives preserves some details and local flavor that might otherwise have been lost if those routine letters had not been kept. So, for example, when Paul Kinsey reprimanded the field rep for Nebraska about personal details in his report, saying, "I do not know what possessed you to give us a detailed account of that incident," the field rep fired back a defense complete with triple underscores, that he had shared the information as a lesson to other field reps, explaining how it was a lesson to me to be careful and watch out for bum steers, and how he narrowly avoided getting into a jam with the Air Force and the local health department by being careful and diplomatic. I really want to know more, but I have not found the backstory on this yet. And the ASHA field rep in Texas sent this explanation back to the main office, apparently in response to someone at ASHA questioning his expense receipts for entertaining officers from Fort Bliss and 3 local sheriffs. This is the vice investigation version of the 3 martini lunch. So he defends the expense with some pithy remarks on the drinking habits of his guests. 3 sheriffs stopped at my home on Saturday en route, at least I thought they were en route, to El Paso. They consumed 3 good fifths of Gibsons at $8 plus per fifth. And then he goes on to say, "What kind of hosts are you, New Yorkers? You know the boys down here. That is, a large proportion drink straight from the bottle." And he comments, "They are a rugged lot." It's a dirty job, but someone has to do it. Okay. The decoded telegram. I hope some of you had a chance to work on that puzzle before the program started. So the field reps and investigators are also the source of the coded telegrams in the files, which they used to send urgent information from a community without revealing the content of their report. It's interesting, none of them ever assess whether the local telegraph office is kind of in on the underworld vice and crime. Never thought of that one. So a number of these telegrams, along with the code book, are preserved in the archives. So here's the key to the puzzle, and follow along to see how you did. And we're not used to telegrams now, so the syntax is going to sound a little odd to us. And any items that appear in parentheses, that's where I'm speculating. So local authorities, city police, very active. Few prostitutes. Findings indicate that conditions in Toledo are tight. Local authorities, city police, very active. Few prostitutes in taverns. 1 wide open brothel beyond city limits, sanctioned county authorities, sheriff. And I'm wondering if this means, does the sheriff department ignore the brothel outside the city limits? Several go-betweens provide prostitutes clandestinely. Many pickups in taverns. So now you know the key to the mystery, and that is the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Many of you are familiar with the James Ford Bell Library. There we go. But for those of you who aren't, I'm going to just provide a teeny little bit of background. James Ford Bell was an alumnus of the University of Minnesota, a member of the university's Board of Regents for more than 20 years, and the founder of General Mills, among many other projects and accomplishments. He decided his legacy at the University of Minnesota would be a rare book library, combining his love of books with his interest in the history of trade. The James Ford Bell Collection, dedicated to the history and impact of trade and cultural exchange, thus was founded in 1953, a collaboration between Mr. Bell and the University of Minnesota Regents. Today, the James Ford Bell Library contains more than 40,000 rare books, maps, manuscripts, archival collections, government documents, and artifacts. My presentation today stems from the heart of this collection, trade and the merchants who traveled the world in the pre-modern period, buying and selling, seeking new products and markets, sharing their experiences, their thoughts, and their lives through the letters that they wrote. The chronology of the bulk of the collection falls within the years 1200 CE and 1800 CE, and that is the period within which the letters I'm going to talk about were written. So let's begin. At a time when few people traveled less than 30 miles from home over the course of their entire lives, merchants were a notable exception. And of course, not all merchants traveled. Those who ran shops, managed warehouses, sold local products to local inhabitants, or served as the domestic agents for their traveling merchant brethren didn't travel any more than the farmer, the blacksmith, or the butcher. Those merchants who did travel could end up hundreds of miles from home for years at a time. This was the situation throughout the pre-modern period, from antiquity through the 19th century. Often, to manage far-flung operations, merchant families or companies would hire agents, called factors, to manage their business interests in particular locales. The Bell Library's collection holds hundreds of merchant letters, written by merchants themselves or written to them by their factors. These letters are wonderful sources of information about goods traded, foreign locales, people and cultures, monetary policies and political situations, and personal news. Sometimes a series of letters will offer insight into business relationships and the foibles of the very human merchants. For example, the archival collection, Bendish Family Papers, reflect the years Sir Thomas Bendish spent as British ambassador to the Ottoman court in the 17th century. As the Crown's representative, Bendish was also governor of the Levant Company, a merchant trading company formed to conduct trade between Britain and the Ottoman Empire. In this capacity, he seems to have been inundated with letters from Levant Company merchants, wanting assistance with sticky political situations, help with financing, letters of safe passage, and many other things. In one short series of letters, we learn about one Mr. Thomas Newsham, a factor of the Levant Company assigned to Galata, the chief business center in the city of Istanbul. Newsham seems to have been doing business on behalf of the company in Smyrna, a Greek city in Turkey on the eastern coast of the Aegean Sea, under Ottoman control. In the archive, we first encounter Mr. Newsham in a letter written by a Mr. John Pixloy, dated 15 August 1650. According to this letter, Mr. Pixloy has had his goods seized by the Ottomans, who are demanding the payment of fines to secure their release. He blames Mr. Newsham for this. On the same day, Pixloy also writes a Mr. John Sauta, also of the Levant Company, complaining that his difficulties could have been prevented if the company had acted to better effect, or possibly acted, period. Mr. Newsham is in trouble. The next letter in the archive is from Thomas Newsham himself. It is addressed to Sir Thomas Bendish and is dated 9 September 1650. In it, Newsham repeatedly pleads for forgiveness for his errors, calling upon the ambassador to kindly overlook the misdeeds of, quote, a young man of small fortune newly entering into the world, end quote. On the same day, Newsham pens another letter to Bendish, lamenting debts and other financial concerns and poor health. He requests permission to depart Smyrna, possibly to return to Istanbul. In other words, he needs to get out of Dodge. The final letter in the series, dated 25 September 1650, finds Newsham still in Smyrna. He again begs Bendish's forgiveness and pleads for his protection as a merchant so that he might salvage what remains of his financial state. The letter begins, quote, "Could I have found anything that would have satisfied these people, besides my utter ruin, I should not have had an occasion to put your lordship to this trouble," end quote. In this brief series of letters, we're provided a glimpse into the foibles of a young merchant, clearly out of his depth, who fails as an agent of the Levant Company to protect another merchant's goods from seizure and the imposition of what was probably an egregiously high fine. He throws himself on the mercy of his boss, the ambassador, and begs both forgiveness and assistance to get him out of the mess in which he's found himself, a mess of his own making, due at least in part to his inexperience. As the final letter suggests, it appears that Sir Thomas Bendish has been less than sympathetic, and it is unlikely that rescue will be forthcoming for poor Mr. Newsham. I find one of the most challenging aspects of teaching history is convincing students to think of the people of the past as real people, rather than two-dimensional characters with whom they have little connection. Letters like this help students to make that connection, to see the people of the past as real people, people not that unlike themselves. The Eastern Mediterranean has always been a venue for international trade, not least in the late Middle Ages when Venice and Genoa vied for commercial power and success. The Bembo family of international merchants was active in the 14th and 15th centuries. Their home base was Venice. They were an ennobled family with several members prominent in Venetian politics, arts, and letters. By 1481, one Marco Bembo was taken over the family trading operation. He began training for his eventual leadership of the company by living and working in the ports where he would later have agents working for him. The company moved goods between some of the most important markets, Bruges and London, Beirut and Famagosta, Crete and Constantinople, and their home base of Venice. In 1476, with his brother Lorenzo, he visited the port of Southampton in England. And from 1479 to 1481, he spent several months in Candia, an important port city in Crete today known as Heraklion, en route to Istanbul and again on his return journey. He quickly established a widespread trading network with depots in the Levant as far as Syria, Tripoli, and Damascus, and in the west in London, Southampton, and Bruges. In Venice, the Bembos had 5 warehouses and specialized in textiles and the wines of the Eastern Mediterranean. Marco Bembo's leadership was successful enough that he began to build a new palazzo for the family and their business on the Grand Canal in Venice, just a few palazzi away from what is now the Rialto Bridge. Unfortunately, this took a tragic turn when Marco fell from the scaffolding in 1484 and died. Marco Bembo wasn't a particularly unique merchant among the Mediterranean merchants of his day. His importance lies in the survival of his correspondence. 3 copybooks, ledgers in which he recorded copies of his own correspondence, survive, which is remarkable for the period. Making them even more unique and valuable is the fact that entries can be matched to the more than 600 surviving letters from his agents. The Bell Library is fortunate to hold some of those letters as well as some written by Marco himself, and I just bought 2 more this morning. This is a letter dated 12 July, 1479, written by Marco to his brother Lorenzo. Marco is in Candia at this time while Lorenzo's managing things in Venice. In it, Marco discusses opportunities for trade in wine, hemp, cloth, and other commodities available in the Eastern Mediterranean. It is 4 pages long. This is page 1. And here are pages 2 and 3. I'd like to tell you that I can read this, but I can't. Not only is the handwriting challenging, but it is written in a Venetian dialect of the 15th century. We were very fortunate to have a graduate student work on these a few years ago, and she was able to read enough to determine what they were about and help us create a finding aid for them. And this is page 4. This is pretty typical. The letter's written on 2 leaves of very thin paper and then folded in such a way that a section on the verso of the second leaf can be used to address the letter. And it's then sealed, and here you can see traces of the wax seal. This is another letter from the Bembo collection written from Candia to Marco by his factor Francesco Giustiniani on May 4th, 1482. It provides insight into current events in Candia. Quote, "My last letter has been entrusted 14 March to a galley of Arbingana with Signor Pier Bragadini. The means provided has complicated the route. He has letters of exchange from Signor Zingrata to Signor Juan Gorges, Honorable Captain of Rhodes. The ship from Liguria did not come, but it will bring excellent wines. The cause of the disease will be thanks to your debtors. The attack of the cursed disease haunts me, but so far I am safe." Now here, Giustiniani is most likely referring to the plague, the Black Death. We're most familiar with the first major Black Death pandemic in the 14th century, but there continued to be outbreaks for the next few hundred years. It struck several ports in the Eastern Mediterranean in the period from 1481 to 1485. Giustiniani is suggesting that he was exposed to the disease from traveling merchants from whom he was collecting payment on behalf of the Bembo enterprise. Reading further, it appears that although he wasn't particularly sick, he had quarantined himself, so he's unable to go down to the port to see to the offloading of cargo on a newly arrived ship. The letter continues by the ship Gribola, which has arrived at the port of Candia, but due to my cursed disease, I cannot take care of myself. It has 500 bales of cloth from Padua. There are a number of details about 4 caravels, which are coming with cloths and clothing of velour. This is our caravel with Michele Basige. The patron is Metallo Romano, who is not pleased by Signor Nicola Abraham. I don't know who those people are, but very important to the Bembo enterprise. This final merchant letter from Italy is another one in the collection, one factor writing to another from Aleppo to Tripoli, which accompanied the transfer of goods. And I included this because you can see the merchant mark that they used. So this letter accompanies the merchant. You take it to the port and they let you have the goods because the mark on your letter corresponds to the mark that are on the shipping crates. So another insight into how trade works during this period. And on the back of the letter, you can see the seals. So through our collections of merchant correspondence, it's possible to build up a pretty in-depth picture of merchant activity in the early modern period and gain insights into a variety of aspects of merchant life. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Some 20 years after the death of Marco Bembo, another Italian merchant rose to prominence, though not for his role as a merchant. Amerigo Vespucci grew up in the shadow of Renaissance humanism at the court of the powerful Medici family in Florence. He was born into a family of wealthy and well-connected merchants and notaries who enjoyed Medici patronage. His uncle, Giorgio Antonio Vespucci, was a humanist scholar and teacher who played an important role in Amerigo's education. Amerigo became a merchant banker in Florence for the Medici. But at the age of 40, he was convinced to upend his comfortable life in Florence and move to Seville in Spain to work with the merchant Giannato Berardi in the Medici's business operations located in that city. The Medici Berardi commercial house in Seville was active in 3 areas: shipbuilding and outfitting, the slave trade, and finance, the latter administered independently of the other 2, but which managed the profits they made. Berardi, who had dealt mainly with the slave trade in Portugal, preferred this activity on which he had built most of his personal fortune. In the early 15th century, the Portuguese crown began sponsoring expeditions into the Atlantic that gradually worked their way down the western coast of Africa. In 1488, Bartolomé Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope at Africa's southern tip, proving that traveling eastward by sea was a viable route, later substantiated by Vasco da Gama, who commanded the first ships to sail directly from Europe to India. So by the 1490s, Lisbon is described as crawling with slaves. They also compensated for the country's demographic crisis. They were very short of population. The Iberian ships reached the so-called Slave Coast, which extended from Mauritania to Sierra Leone, and their administrative officer, the Meister, bought slaves from Arab traders or tribal chieftains, and even from families in the poorest villages. Sometimes they acquired slaves through skirmishes and raids into the interior, albeit not without cost. Purchase was preferable to capture, as the individuals most suitable to the European market could then be chosen. Amerigo Vespucci was often employed by Berardi as such a Meister, which led him to travel to the Canary Islands and along the coast of Guinea. Slaves from these places were among the most sought after as household slaves for wealthy Europeans. Amerigo wrote of these voyages in a letter known as the Ridolfi Fragment. I have navigated across all the parallels from Morocco to the ends of Ethiopia. Vespucci goes on to describe those places with the words of one who has seen them with his own eyes. All the land of Ethiopia is sparsely populated. There is a lack of fresh water, it rains very little, and the soil is very sandy and scorched by the heat of the sun. There are endless sandy deserts and very few forests or woods, and the prevailing winds in these parts are the Levanter and Sirocco, which are hot. It is letters like this, many of them have been disputed by scholars as not being authentic, or at least not being written by Vespucci himself, that brought Amerigo Vespucci his renown. In Seville, he met Christopher Columbus. In addition to outfitting a fleet for the Spanish crown, Vespucci also outfitted the ships for Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic in 1498. An expediter and entrepreneur whose yearning for adventure may have been inspired by Columbus, Vespucci became enamored of the idea of exploration, an overseas adventure. On the eve of the 16th century, he decided to leave his comfortable city life. It turns out he was in some financial difficulties as well. And at the age of nearly 50, he took up the challenge of the high seas. In a letter to a friend in Seville, he wrote, "I have resolved to abandon trade and to aspire to something more praiseworthy and enduring. So it came about that I arranged to go see a portion of the world and its marvels." In 1499, he joined the expedition of Alonso de Ojeda on behalf of Spain to further explore the new territory brought to European attention by Columbus. In 1501, Vespucci sailed to the New World again, this time for Portugal. It is in the letters that Vespucci wrote describing what he saw that Europe got its first glimpse of the Americas. Now remember, Columbus wrote that he'd found the Indies. So that is what readers of his letters envisioned. It is Vespucci's descriptions of the indigenous people he encountered, which can be found to some degree in all of his letters, that is most striking. For example, when writing of the Tupi of Brazil, he states, "They are tall and agile runners and tireless swimmers, the women even more so than the men. One can see them swimming alone as far as 2 leagues out from the beach and back. The women also are able to carry burdens that the men cannot, and carry them for incredible distances." He also wrote that the Tupi, quote, "talk little and in low voices, using the same accents as ourselves, as they form the words either on the palate or teeth or lips, except they use other names for things," quote. While this may seem like natural humanist interest, given Vespucci's humanist education, it more likely comes from his years in the slave trade. A slave commanded a lower price if he or she was difficult for a buyer or owner to understand. Ever the merchant, Vespucci is suggesting that the Tupi might fetch a high price if enslaved. Although only one of the many letters attributed to Amerigo Vespucci concerning his American adventures can be verified, the letter to Piero de Tomasi Soderini, the leader of the Florentine Republic, and the letter to Lorenzo de Pier Francesco de Medici, his one-time schoolmate and patron, had the most lasting impact, even if today they have been called into question by scholars. In his letter to Soderini, Vespucci claims to have made a total of 4 voyages across the Atlantic, 2 sailing under the flag of Spain, 2 under the Portuguese. In his letter to Lorenzo, however, Vespucci wrote concerning his 1501 voyage, "On a former occasion, I wrote to you at some length concerning my return from those new regions which we found and explored with the fleet, at the cost and by the command of his most serene King of Portugal. And these we may rightly call a new world, because our ancestors had no knowledge of them, and it will be a matter wholly new to all those who hear about them." He continued, "For this transcends the view held by our ancients, inasmuch as most of them did hold that there is no continent to the south beyond the equator, but only the sea which they named the Atlantic. And if some of them did aver that a continent there was, they denied with abundant argument that it was a habitable land. But that this their opinion is false and utterly opposed to the truth. This my last voyage has manifest. For in those southern parts I have found a continent more densely peopled and abounding in animals than our Europe or our Asia or Africa, and in addition a climate milder and more delightful than in any other region known to us, as you shall learn." This letter was translated into Latin from the original Italian and published at Paris in 1503 under the title Mundus Novus, New World. Vespucci's vivid style, focusing on scenes of sexual liberty and cannibalism, made it an immediate international bestseller. It was published again at Augsburg, Germany in 1504, and another edition was published in 1505 at Strasbourg by Martin Ringman, and this shows you the first page of Ringman's edition. That same year, Ringman was hired by an agent of the Duke of Lorraine, Rene II, to join a group of scholars in a small town not far from Strasbourg called Saint-Dié. It was there that he met Martin Waldseemüller, a German printer and cartographer. Together they wrote a small book, Introductio Cosmographiae, Introduction to Cosmography, to accompany 2 maps created by Waldseemüller. In the back of the book, they published Vespucci's letter to Soderini titled The 4 Voyages of Amerigo Vespucci. Both men, on the basis of Vespucci's letters, were convinced that credit for the discovery of the New World should be given to him. They named the New World America in Vespucci's honor, a feminine version of his first name in keeping with the feminine names of the other continents, Europa, Africa, and Asia. And they carved the name America inside the known boundaries of the new southern continent on both maps, a small globe gores and a 12-panel wall map. If this talk does nothing else, let it remind you never to underestimate the power of a letter. Thank you. I guess we have time for a few questions.
And
Yes.
and here, I'll bring the mic out to you so the folks online will hear you.
I want to ask a question about the Vespucci records. Is there some reason to think that they're controversial? What's the controversy about? And are the documents that you have shown, are they in our collection?
The 2 printed editions of the letters and a couple of other that have been printed are in our collection. The original letters are in collections in Italy, and they've been called into question by scholars because Vespucci exaggerated his role on the voyages. He wasn't a navigator. He was 50 years old when he joined his first voyage with no training as a navigator. And so he writes the letters as though he is an expert and that he gives himself all the credit for everything that happens on board ship. Also, the letter with the 4 voyages looks like it's a combination of multiple letters that have been cobbled together and not very seamlessly. And so they think that, okay, somebody saw some other correspondence, put it all together, slapped Vespucci's name on it, and that's what we have. So right now, scholars think that the 1501 letter to Lorenzo is probably accurate because The captain of the ship did list Vespucci among the crew. The other one also seems maybe a little accurate, but there's a huge body of letters and scholars argue about them all the time.
I was curious as to how they were getting these letters back and forth and how long it took.
They go by ship, they go over land. Generally, people, if they really were desperate to get their letter, they would make multiple copies and send them by different ways to ensure that they got to one particular, to the location they went. Sometimes letters went down with the ship. Sometimes they never reached their destination. So that's why it was practiced to send them by multiple, if you could afford it, because sending it by somebody, unless you knew somebody, could be expensive.
Collecting things. You would probably get a Socrates catalog and find these letters, and I don't know how you would get the letters that you got.
In the Social Welfare History Archives, we do not purchase collections. They are donated and they're given to the University of Minnesota libraries usually by the organization or the individual that created the material. So it's a process of developing a relationship with that person, working with them to transfer the materials to the archives, but we don't make any purchases.
The Bell Library, on the other hand, purchases its material almost exclusively. And because of its age, we go through reputable dealers who verify its authenticity and its accuracy. Then they send it to us for approval. And then I go through the same process to make sure I'm happy that it is what it says it is. So it can be a very long process. So while Linnea and some of my other colleagues develop relationships with organizations and the individuals who own the materials, we develop the relationships with rare book dealers.
Here we got one. I'll bring the mic up. There you go.
How do you discern what to keep and what may have value in the future, even though it may not have any value now?
That is an excellent question that would take several weeks to answer. But it's based partly on the subject expertise of the curators. And I'm now speaking for archival curators, not for rare books librarians. The subject expertise of the curators of the different archives. So our knowledge of the history of the particular subject that the archives documents or subjects. And then also the relationships that we build with these organizations or the connections that we make with people. So one example in the Social Welfare History Archives is that we now collect collections related to the history of intimate partner violence. And that was something that was recommended to us by people working in the movement. And we had the conversations with them and decided to collect that material. So if you're talking about within an individual collection, what we really try to do, and this can take a very long time, it takes a lot of intellectual and physical labor to do this work, is we take a look at that collection as a whole, and we try to understand how all of those pieces relate to each other. And then it can also just be simple things like, are there 20 copies of the same report in this file? We don't need to keep all 20 copies, right? So it's a lot of different layers of assessment or what we call appraisal of a collection, and probably a very different process from what goes on in the libraries.
Well, and we also take into consideration the research trends at the time. Who's researching? Do we have researchers who are asking about this topic? So if they are and we don't have anything, we then talk to experts in the field, and maybe we should be adding those materials to our collection. We let the faculty and some of the graduate students dictate whether we build that area of the collection this particular year because that's what they really need, or we hold off because we have more than they can possibly use during the time that they're here. So that plays a role as well.
One more. Here, real quick. There you go. So in terms of transparency, especially with your presentation, do you run into the issues of impediments that the government, that certain rules based on state government doesn't want to show their dirty laundry? How do you go about? You find that quite a task.
Also a great question. The records in the Social Welfare History Archives are from private sector organizations. So I am not, for example, the archivist of the state of Minnesota, right? So the materials that I'm working with come from individuals or they come from organizations that are non-governmental entities. And we still try to pay attention to issues of privacy, respecting the files that might be about, challenging times in people's lives. But it's a somewhat different scenario than if I was working for a governmental archive. So.
Thank you, Maggie, and thank you, Linnea. Before we close out, I would like to note that there are currently 3 exhibits in the building. Down on the ground floor is Grey Wolf at 50, First Drafts, Next Pages, celebrating the 50th anniversary of Grey Wolf Press. It's in the ground floor exhibit space in the Maxine Wallen Center for Archives and Special Collection Research. Just across the hall is Dear Community, Mail, Correspondence and Postal Activism and LGBTQ History, put on by the Treader Collection. And then the global reach of local activism, Minnesota's human rights stories, are on the 2nd and 3rd floor of the building. For those of you who are interested in a tour, Chris Kiesling will be right back there at the end. And thank you so much for coming. And we look forward to hosting you in April with presentations by the Children's Literature Research Collection and the Treader Collection and GLBT Studies. Thank you.